All right, folks, welcome back to Talkin' Soccer. I am Justin Horniker. Welcome back to the podcast. It's been a bit, but we're going to start rolling with this thing. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you are a paid subscriber to the Substack, you're going to be getting this a little bit ahead of time as opposed to the YouTube subscribers and the podcast subscribers. This episode is going to be about the latest round of the MLS Cup playoffs. We're going to talk about the playoff format. We're going to talk about Inter Miami and the general outlook of that just massive choke job and losing to the number 9 team Atlanta, which I am. Let's save that. Let's save it, Justin. Let's save it. And then from there, we're going to talk a little USMNT forecast this week's games and what we think of the roster. The other episode this week, our women's side of things, we're going to talk about the NWSL quarterfinals, which took place last weekend. I was actually at the match in KC. There's an article up on the Substack right now, just kind of detailing that if you'd like to read, if you'd like to see the quotes. And we're going to talk about that along with Lily Johannes and look ahead a little bit to the end of the month for the USWNT as well and just what that looks like. We might touch on some USL stuff too. Welcome in. The MLS playoffs are on their break officially as we head into the international window. And if you have followed me before, you know my thoughts on the format, on, what I think about this break as well. And I've kind of come around to the idea that, the format itself is not the problem. I talked about this a bit, and I think, writing this article this week and just, thinking about it a little bit further, that my problem isn't necessarily the wild card into best of three, into single elimination. As much as I don't enjoy the lack of continuity between the rounds, I think that the best of three round itself is not the problem. The problem is that you go from best of three soccer, this captivating, this incredible matchup like you saw in Atlanta and Miami, and with New York and Cincinnati, these really high, intense match threes, and then you go from that directly into 2 weeks off for the international window. Now, the November window is something that MLS has had to navigate for its entire existence. I think that's one of the main reasons why the schedule switch from what we do now, the spring to fall/winter, into, more European calendar, which would be starting in the fall, taking a winter break, continuing on to where your playoffs are more in late spring, early summer. I think that part of it intrigues me, especially if you're matching up with some of the more significant windows. You can probably have a little bit better of an opportunity to fit your playoffs in when everywhere, most other places in the world, they're also playing their important games, their important soccer. And I think that aspect of it is maybe a little bit underlooked when we talk about what's going to happen in the spring and the winter, your December, your January games that everyone, initially focuses on, that I initially focus on as well. But before we get into the actual playoff games, if we talk about that schedule a little bit, if we were to go from, fall to late November, early December, of course, in the Midwest, in the north of the U.S., in Toronto and Montreal, those matches are going to be difficult. But I think there could be a way, and of course, this would be trusting MLS to do it smartly, where hosting during that time, and this also goes into the fact that MLS doesn't have a balanced schedule as well, and it's impossible to have a balanced schedule. So you can maybe lean into that and say, all right, we're going to play in the South, we're going to play in on the West Coast, on the Southeast Coast for those late winter games and those early February games. If we extend everything by 2 weeks one way or the other, because that's essentially what's happening. You extend things by 2 weeks into November and December, and then you extend things 2 weeks forward into February, and then you have this nice calendar that kind of matches up with the European calendar. It helps everyone with their transfers, and it helps MLS in its schedule in its playoffs, because right now we're heading into this downtime where, all right, the U.S. are playing Jamaica. It's maybe not the most exciting match. Richo Pochettino is still trying to figure out his squad, not making a ton of adjustments, and it's not the most compelling. At least for me, I'm looking at it as Jamaica could be a tough matchup, but I don't think people are necessarily like looking forward to a Nations League match as, the end all be all. And there is a significant drop off in terms of like attention, and especially when we talk about these games, just how exhilarating some of these matchups are going to end up being. So when you have a cup playoffs that breed drama, you have these best of 3 series where 50% of them are going to that third game. And my outlook has changed this year as well, because last year when no team that lost game 1 was able to advance in the series, in my mind, it was, okay, this is going to benefit that team that can win that first game. This is going to benefit the favorites. It's going to benefit the teams with home field advantage. But if you look at this year, if you look at these matchups, 50% of them are upsets. So in this best of 3 series that is supposed to help the home teams in a league where home field advantage is so important with travel and just the atmospheres, the playoffs have kind of flipped that on its head to where Atlanta are winning in Miami, New York is winning in Cincinnati, Columbus is losing at home, like Minnesota is beating Real Salt Lake, that's the other one. And not to say that home field advantage is overblown, but I think it, instead of saying the home team, the team that is the favorite are the ones that benefit from it, it's really the teams that play to their underlying numbers are the ones that benefit. Because if you look at Miami, we'll get to this when I kind of go through the matchup specifically, but when you look at Miami this year, it is kind of interesting just how much they outplayed their underlying numbers. If you look at their expected goal differential, it's less than 1. And of course, they had like a 23 goal differential and ran away with the Supporter Shield, all-time MLS points record. But the problem is when you get to the playoffs, when games shrink down, there are less opportunities. You need to be able to stand tall defensively. Miami were just never able to do that. They were never able to slow the game down. They were never able to, I shouldn't say slow the game down, but they were never able to, take the sting out of their opponent's chances, to the point where Atlanta, even after Miami come back and draw the game, were never able to, or Atlanta, I guess, were able to, come back down the field almost immediately and put in an important touch. Exactly. So let's get into it a little bit then. First it was, Minnesota looking like the better team against Real Salt Lake. The Red Bulls knocking out the Crew. Then you had NYCFC setting up a Hudson River derby in the next round, because after NYCFC beat Cincinnati, now you're going to have Red Bulls, NYCFC at Shea Stadium. I think that's the interesting thing too, is that it almost feels like a disappointment for MLS. Miami are out. Of course, Messi and Miami have all the marketing dollars behind them, because obviously they come with the attention, the fan support from Barcelona and from their past life as being one of the greats in modern football, to where, MLS is looking at a New York versus New York battle. They're looking at a potential LA versus LA battle and another LAFC versus Seattle battle, where, those are your big markets, whereas Seattle, like, media market wise, isn't one of the biggest. It's still a really good sized market on a soccer side, one of the prestige markets in the US for soccer. So, and then you have a really compelling matchup in the Galaxy and Minnesota. You have Atlanta and Orlando, which was kind of the premier Southwestern derby before Miami came into the league, to where you're looking at these matchups and you're like, oh man, well, if Miami was in, they'd have so much more eyeballs. And I just don't know if that's true necessarily, especially if Atlanta is drawing that many eyes. In Atlanta, they had 68,000 for their away game against Miami, or for their home game. Miami was away. And whereas Miami couldn't sell out either of their playoff games, Atlanta is packing the Benz. It's an explosive atmosphere again. And Atlanta's a sleeping giant. We all know what that fan base can be. We know what that team can be. Maybe this win over Miami is enough to kind of set things forward. So let's look at the series themselves that kind of turned everything on their head. Because, of course, you have the straightforward matchups. The favorites win, of course. But the more compelling games for me, anyway, are games like Real Salt Lake and Minnesota, where series like Real Salt Lake and Minnesota, where Real Salt Lake were able to kind of figure things out down the stretch, but there was a point in time throughout the middle to end of the season where Salt Lake had clearly lost something. Whereas after the Leagues Cup, Minnesota could have been one of the best teams in the league. And I think this is similar to, like, personally, I feel it covering St. Louis against Kansas City last year. It's a similar kind of thing that happened. And I think that's why this upset doesn't feel as big as the ones on the other side of the bracket, because Minnesota were trending up, Salt Lake are trending down. And much like that KC and St. Louis matchup last year, when you have a really hot team against a team that kind of limped into the playoffs, that momentum means a lot. And in a long season, you kind of are what your recent results say you are. For Minnesota, that was a good team. And for Salt Lake, that was a not so good team. And it ends in Minnesota winning over 2 matches. And it's a big upset in terms of like a 6 versus a 3. And a Real Salt Lake that was pushing for the Western Conference lead for much of this season. They're out in the first round. But for every matchup like that, you have the Galaxy running over the Rapids, you have Seattle, which the Seattle matchups were also interesting because Houston playing their low event style. Seattle were still able to win that matchup pretty handily. LAFC over Vancouver, even though Vancouver made that one tough. And then Orlando over Charlotte, that one was pretty straightforward. And then, although Charlotte did make it interesting with that home match, winning penalties, of course. And then you had 2 upsets with Cincinnati, NYC, and Columbus, and the Red Bulls. So let's look at Columbus Crew and New York Red Bulls, because it's not just about Miami being knocked out and the juggernaut that they were this season, but the Columbus Crew as well. And I think more so than Miami, this is essentially the Crew running out of steam and really feeling their inability to replace Jordan Morris, I think, is the big thing. Because when you look at getting to this point in the season, getting to this point in the playoffs, depth becomes tantamount to what you do. And Columbus have had a very long season, making it to the final of the CONCACAF Champions Cup, making it to the final of the Leagues Cup, and then to come to the playoffs where you've been fighting since February. Now you're in November. It's tough, right? Crew completely ran on empty. I don't know if many people had this on their bingo card, especially as the Red Bull did not look good through much of the second half of the season. But I think crucially, Red Bulls play Columbus on decision day. Red Bulls lose to Columbus on decision day. But in the playoffs where these individual matchups are so important, it gave Sandro Schwartz and his coaching staff something to really dig into, to where, all right, Columbus maybe don't have the depth that they had earlier in this year. They maybe don't feel as confident as they did earlier this year. Some of the stopgaps that they brought in to, essentially try to be that Aiden Morris, are the younger players they brought up to try to be that Aiden Morris replacement, haven't quite done that yet, which is fine. But in the playoffs, when you need your two-way midfielders, when you need someone who can really bang on both sides of the pitch, that's where New York benefited from that decision day loss. And the Crew were just limited to low XG opportunities throughout the entire series. The Crew could, maybe consider it lucky that a 3-match series would allow them to have a short memory, despite in game 1, the Red Bull generated more XG on target. And then you get to game 2, and Columbus just weren't able to control Emil Forsberg. And I think the story of this series, that Emil Forsberg came alive for the Red Bull, and they just had that consistency over the 2 games, whereas Columbus, Wilfred Nancy saying after the match, maybe it's because I come from Europe, but to me, the more important thing is our consistency over the season. Of course, there's disappointment, but we have to be proud of the entire season. Last year, we were 3rd in the Supporters' Shield. This year, we were 2nd. Now we must repeat, but better. That's the idea. So for Columbus, too, at the end of the season, it doesn't seem like, at least from their talking points, that maybe they weren't as motivated as the Red Bull were to essentially live and die by this result. If New York goes out in the first round, it's like, okay, you squeaked into the playoffs again. Your playoff streak is alive, but when 9 teams make the playoffs, when I forget, Joe Lowry's stat is always like 65% of the league makes the playoffs. It's really not impressive to have such a long streak. But if that first match, I think, really set the tone because it was a bit of a masterclass smash and grab. You limit the crew to these low XG opportunities. You're able to take advantage of your one opportunity, essentially, and then just bunker down and make Columbus play desperate. So then you get to New York, you get to Harrison, I should say, and the energy in Red Bull Stadium, Red Bull Arena was something that wasn't necessarily felt as much this season. I think I've watched a lot of games, both Red Bull, Gotham, NYCFC, all playing at Red Bull Arena, and this is the loudest, the most energy I've felt from it in quite a while, and that's even including Gotham's, I think they had 15,000 in the playoff game last week. I think that kind of fuels some of what had happened. Get that upset over Columbus. Cucho out of the playoffs. My MVP pick. Out of the playoffs now in the second round. And while MLS is, now hurting for star power a little bit, they get the Hudson River Derby in the Eastern Conference semifinals. And for me, where I would maybe I always want to see the best team advance. I want to see a final where it's Columbus duking it out with LAFC. Are the Red Bull going to be able to make the final? Probably not. But that compelling nature of this huge upset was something that, we didn't think was necessarily possible when this 3-game series was devised last season. And I think it maybe supports the format a little bit when these upsets can happen over 3 games, when that home pitch advantage can be alleviated. The owners get their home game right. I think that was the big thing about this, is owners want to have that extra playoff revenue. Apple wanted these compelling broadcasts, which they definitely get. And I think for Columbus, they're not going to be too upset. Looking around at the kind of aftermath with where they've been this season, the success they've had this season, unless this is like a canary in the coal mine kind of moment, unless Will Fernandez doesn't return next year, gets an offer from somewhere else, unless something astronomical happens, Columbus will be back next year, and like Nance said in his post-match comments, hoping to challenge for the Supporters' Shield, essentially. So next up, so that match was first. That was the first upset of the docket. Next, we go out west. Real Salt Lake losing to Minnesota United over 2 matches in a series where Minnesota only scores 1 goal, but they win 2 penalty kick shootouts. Dane Sinclair doing phenomenal work here. And a sweep. And while I think this was easier to forecast, just because, like I said in the intro, Minnesota have been very good all year. Well, all second half of the year. And they play a style into Eric Ramsey where it's low danger soccer. You're slowing it down. You're taking advantage of your opportunities. That is usually a style that bodes very well for playoff soccer. I think we've seen it. We see it all the time across sports, is that these teams that can play in a defensive lockdown kind of style that limit their chances against are always going to have success in the playoffs against teams that are maybe perceived to be more talented than they are. As a strategy that might bear some different results as they play the Galaxy, who won 9-1 over the Rapids next round. Figuring out how to slow down Ricky Puig is probably a little bit tougher than slowing down Chicho Arango, who has not been himself over the second half of the season. And, Salt Lake fans can also feel a little bit hard done over the fact that they never lost in the run of play. It's a 0-0 draw and a 1-1 draw where they lost on PKs over both games. At some point you have to score to win, and you have to take advantage of your chances to win. But the fact that Minnesota weren't necessarily the better team than them, despite how poorly they kind of played in the lead up, I think Pablo Mastroeni can go into next year maybe a little bit hungrier because of this. They have some roster decisions to make. Things just did not go well over the second half of the season for them. And Mastroeni said, we did all these things, speaking to their run over the first half of the season, speaking to Chicho Arango's play through the first half of the season. But it wasn't great because we didn't win a title. I want to win titles. And I think when you look at what RSL have done over the past 5 years, punching above their weight, what they've been able to build, there's no reason to think that they can't be better next year, that they can't figure some things out over the offseason. But the loss definitely hurts given the start that they had, and given that how many chances do you have with any window? There's no guarantee that this core group is going to be around for that long, especially with how things kind of blew up this year. So how many bites of the apple do you have? Like, you can't be wasting opportunities like this against a team that doesn't really have a good track record of scoring goals, but it turns out they don't need it. Dane Sinclair was fantastic throughout the series, winning back-to-back PK shootouts, getting that clean sheet, saving a lot of goals. And for Eric Ramsey, believes that his Loons are peaking at the right time. 3 wins away, we can beat anyone in this league, and we are a good match for the Galaxy, he said after the win. So, Minnesota has the Galaxy next. As I said earlier, it's LAFC versus Seattle, and whenever we come back from the international break. That's a good slate of Western Conference matches. I think it probably ends up as in LA Derby and El Tráfico in the conference finals, and that is going to be something that, when you look back at the playoffs and you say, what were the key matchups? Dav and El Tráfico with the way that the Galaxy and LAFC, not to count any of these teams out before it happens, because I think if you count Seattle out ever, you're going to end up paying for it. So I don't want to, count my chickens before they hatch. But even a Seattle and Minnesota conference final is a compelling matchup as well, because there's some animosity between those fan bases that I think goes a little bit under the radar. And that could be very interesting. So let's move on to the Eastern Conference. FC Cincinnati versus NYCFC. Pat Noonan's FC Cincinnati suffer another first round heartbreak. And in writing this article, I realized that Cincinnati, not to say that it was expected, but they haven't really been able to replace Aaron Bupenza's goal scoring output, or what they expected his goal scoring output to be before he was ultimately released from the team. And bringing on Nico Gioacchini obviously didn't work. Gioacchini played 1 minute over these 3 matches. So you have strikers that you don't necessarily believe in if you're Pat Noonan. You have Lucho Acosta, who is, of course, as good as he ever is. But when you don't have the players to finish off these chances that Acosta is creating, that's when the problems come in. That's when a team like NYCFC that does have those kind of battle-tested players can come in and knock you off, essentially. And, for the final match to be a 0-0 PK loss, to the point where Nico Gioacchini doesn't make an appearance, I think that signifies how Cincinnati felt that his loan stint went, right? I think also evidenced by this is that Tom Bogert reported pretty much directly the day after Cincinnati are knocked out of the playoffs, that they have a club record $15 million fee for Kevin Danke, who is the Golden Boot winner for Cercle Bruges in the Belgian league this season. That's put your money where your mouth is, right? That's just such a great example of understanding what your issue is, going out, grabbing that player. But the thing is that you have to be willing to spend. And for Cincinnati to be willing to spend on a DP striker that has proven himself in a pretty good league, Belgian league, and for a player like Kevin Danke to see MLS as an option, someone who is going into the prime, he's in his prime, has years left in his prime, but maybe sees MLS as that intermediate option of you can come to MLS, you can make good salary, you can have a lot of eyes on you, and maybe still earn that move to one of the big European clubs. But if not, being in Cincinnati, where the fan engagement is great, where you have a lot of eyes on you, where you can be part of a ambitious team, I think it's easy to sell. It's getting a lot easier to sell, I should say, these players on that vision. And Hugo Kuipers going to Chicago Fire from the Belgian league last year. There is precedent for these Golden Boot players to come in and have a decent impact. Of course, you can't necessarily judge any Chicago Fire player on setting the market, but the fact that Cincinnati, who are a smart team, can go out back in the Belgian league, grab Danke, I think it's a good sign for Cincinnati and for the league, really. Focusing on NYCFC, I think they have to see a pretty clear path into the conference final now, and why they are the better team compared to the Red Bull. And while it's a derby match, anything can happen regardless of where the teams are in their form. When you look at how Matt Freese has played this year, he's one of the best goalkeepers in MLS this season. I didn't vote for him because I voted for the Charlotte keeper, and looking at my ballot earlier in the year, Matt Freese was definitely my vote, but things kind of happened throughout the season, and Matt Freese has still been sharp. He's still been very good, but just he kind of fell off that top keeper numbers. But post-shot expected goals, he's always been up there in the top 3 this year, and here in the playoffs where I think what we learned from these upsets is that a team needs a great goalkeeper. I think goalkeepers in all these series have kind of been the star men as much as goalkeepers are in any match. To hear Cushing talk about it, said in playoff soccer, the margins are so small. And last season, Matt came in, had to be patient to get his opportunities, had to be patient to get the shirt. And Matt's growing into a real leader for this group. He has a real presence in the locker room. He has a real drive. I think that's, just speaking to Matt Freese, just stepping up. Matt Freese, 25, maybe deserves a shot. If Zach Steffen can still be in the U.S. men's national team, I don't know why Matt Freese isn't being given a shot, especially because Matt Freese was markedly better than Zach Steffen this year in every aspect of goalkeeping. So just based on the fact that Freese has never been called in before, I think there's that bigger gap that you have to climb up. And Zach Steffen, I don't know if it's a sunk cost fallacy. I don't know if it's just that they see what happened this year more on Colorado's defense than him himself. But Zach Steffen, in terms of regular goalkeepers, was the worst in the league in terms of post-shot expected goals numbers. So when the difficulty of shots that he faces, he is the worst in the league at saving shots that he should save, essentially. And, you could maybe argue, okay, well, Zach Steffen's much better at it with his feet. But if you watch the Colorado and LA Galaxy series, Zach Steffen, early on in the match, goes out to send the ball downfield, and Gabriel Peck is running in on him and just kind of turns his hip into the ball, and Zach Steffen clears it into him. It goes into his net, and it is just such an example of being overconfident, I guess, in your ability to play the ball, and then not being able to make the saves to make up for it down the line. I think Matt Freese deserves an opportunity in net for the USMNT. So that's my final takeaway as NYCFC upset Cincinnati. I think for Cincinnati, before we move on, like I said, with the Kevin Danke stuff, they're in a good spot. I think they're going to be heartbroken to, it kind of compounds on the loss to Columbus last year, where you maybe see this opportunity for you to come into the playoffs, have that home series, have that home match. But like I said, with RSL, you have to take advantage when you have this window. I think Cincinnati understand the challenge. They understand that, they are up against it, especially with the expectations now that they've turned the corner, that they have to bring home some sort of silverware to, outside of last year's Supporter Shield, to really say that this has been a successful period. If Danke can come in, if they can finally get over that hump in the playoffs next year, then you say, okay, these last 2 playoff heartbreaks are worth it because now we're battle tested. Now we can show that we've learned from those experiences. We've brought in players that are going to help with those experiences. However, if next year goes south as well, now you're looking at 3 straight playoff heartbreaks. You're looking at Pat Noonan, who you're maybe starting to question, is there something about how he manages elimination games? I don't know. But just something to think about as we head into the offseason, as we head towards next season. A little bit of punditry there for you. Okay, finally, the final upset of the weekend, of the round, Inter Miami versus Atlanta United. Lionel Messi fears Brad Guzan, I think, is what we are learning. And I just see this gif of Brad Guzan being pushed into the net, trying to pull himself out of the net as Luis Suarez is in his face and going back at him. That'll be the everlasting image of this series. But like I said at the hop, Miami, while they had a record-breaking season, while they obviously have the players to, some of the best players in the world, if not on the other side of their aging curve, they still have or should have the talent to get past the 9th seeded Atlanta United that lost Thiago Almeida earlier this year, that lost Giacomakis earlier this year, and haven't replaced them yet. I think that's the craziest thing about this Atlanta run, is that they sold 2 of their best players in the summer and were never, have not replaced them yet, for the most part. Seba Labenze has been very good, but they're still missing that Almada type. Don't say that to Dax McCarty, though. Dax McCarty in the Thiago Almada role, of course, very similar players. 37-year-old Dax McCarty, along with the 37-year-old Brad Guzan. A couple of old heads. That experience, I think, matters in a match where Miami usually are the ones pulling off those veteran tricks, and Atlanta were able to step up to it every time. And I think the lasting image of this series for me, Atlanta win Game 2 in Atlanta in front of 68,000. It's a match that, showed why Atlanta are Miami's bogey team. And that is, Miami just are not capable of shrinking the field, of limiting transition opportunities. In the playoffs, in these one-offs, you have to. And if if you watch the last 2 or 3 years of Messi at Barca, these guys in this Miami club, those last 2 years they had together at Barca, a lot of similar things are happening to where, everything's just so wide open. You're relying on Busquets to make that last-ditch tackle. You're relying on these guys to come through in these moments of brilliance. But when you're in MLS and these guys are surrounded by some players that aren't as good as the full roster on that Barca team, and you have parity in a league where, Atlanta have players that can come up and can have these one-off performances, I think they're kind of playing for Rob Valentino as well. It comes down to Tata Martino having some flubs over his time in Miami already. And, of course, we know from how things ended with Mexico that Tata makes some questionable decisions, and he's upended by his old team here. Some of the fun things, I think, is the relevance and importance of Brad Guzan. And this is a story that I told on the Substack as well. I have an article from last month just talking about Brad Guzan's run, that final game, into the play-in game in Montreal, and then to come into the series. He prevented 2.14 goals over those 3 matches, but it's more than that. From last year where he looked like he was maybe going to be out of the league to this year where he was back to being one of the best shot stoppers in the league. He's doing that, stopping goals that he's maybe not expected to stop, but also just being that emotional touchstone as well for Atlanta. Like, you see it, like I said, in that 3rd game where Campana comes up from behind him, pushes him into the net. Suarez comes up, yells at him to get out of the net, and he fires back up and goes at Suarez. Like, Brad Guzan is a competitor, and you need that guy in your locker room when you are a team like Atlanta, playing for Rob Valentino, playing to upset the team that just broke the MLS points record. It's an incredible story. And for a team like Atlanta where, like I said, they had 68,000 in the Benz for Game 2, like, that's a team with a fan base that is hungry for this team to be good, hungry for this team to put these results on the table that have been, begging for a direction over the past few years to kind of get back to the heights of a few years ago, those Miguel Almiron, Joseph Martinez teams. And you get a moment like this where it does feel a bit like a turning point. If Atlanta, whatever happens from here on out, you're a 9th seed, you stuck into the playoffs by the play-in game, and now you've beaten the best team that MLS has ever seen in the regular season. It's the biggest upset ever in MLS. And while I think Apple execs might be a little bit sad that the guy that they put all their marketing money behind, so now you have to see all these Messi commercials as you watch Miami be knocked out of the playoffs, it might be hard done by that a little bit. But you can't rig a sporting competition for any specific team. And I think that MLS is going to be okay with how these things wind up. Because now you have Atlanta facing Orlando, which Atlanta and Orlando, that's a big series as well. They're, maybe not arch rivals anymore, but before Miami came in, Orlando was Atlanta's biggest rival. Atlanta was Orlando's biggest rival. You still have that animosity there. I don't know. That'll be a good question for Atlanta. Let me know if you're an Atlanta United fan down in the comments who you consider your biggest rival these days. Is it Nashville? Is it Charlotte? Is it still Orlando? Is it Miami? Because I think that is interesting with where they're located and just the real battleground that is the southeast of the U.S. soccer at this point. And I think this match in particular really puts a nail in my argument that was that the best of three format didn't really do what it was supposed to do, but maybe that was just year one hijinks. Here we come. Miami, from a talent standpoint, from a season result standpoint, from a this team just should be better standpoint. And they come in against Atlanta, who have been their bogey team this year, and they let them stay in games. They let them come back in games, and it ultimately ends up being their undoing. Maybe that's, a lesson to Miami to now go out and build up their defense a little bit more. That would be my suggestion. Maybe this is Atlanta's time to move on from Tata Martino to bring in someone with some more progressive ideas that could make the team something other than Luis Suarez, something other than Lionel Messi. Because it's obvious that during the summer, while Miami were playing above their means without Messi, without Suarez, we give Campana a bigger role, we give Redondo a bigger role. Come playoffs where maybe that's not possible anymore, something has to change there, whether it's player composition, whether it's, like I said, coaching in these one-off games, whether it's just investing in better center backs. I think could potentially be a big spot for them too, if they can move some TAM around. But it's very interesting, and I think it speaks to how MLS clubs need to build their rosters, and it also speaks to what is success in MLS. With Miami, they won the Supporters Shield, most points all time in the MLS regular season. Do you call that a success when they were knocked out in the quarterfinals of the CONCACAF Champions Cup, knocked out in the quarterfinals of the Leagues Cup, knocked out in the first round of the MLS Cup playoffs? Like, 3 huge losses in a row in knockout competitions where you didn't even make the final 8 of all 3 competitions. It's it leads to questions like, what do they do from here? How do we arrive here? What do they do from here? So we kind of laid out what those conference semifinals are going to look like. I want to move into some USMNT talk before we wrap things up today. Let me know in the comments what round you're most looking forward to, and then if this break in the action has kind of killed off your enthusiasm for the playoffs, or if the upsets this round are so compelling that they're just going to force you to watch this next round. So, Mauricio Pochettino announced the roster for this week's USMNT games. On Thursday, they play in Jamaica. On Monday, they play in St. Louis, where I will be. And I want to talk about the goalkeeper position, but also the forward position. I think those are the 2 spots where I have some questions on what we're doing here. And I think some of that is Mauricio Pochettino doesn't want to rock the boat too much while trying to figure out how we want to play, maybe keeping some of that continuity around in these games that do have some competitive meaning. But 4 goalkeepers in this camp. Diego Cohen from Barcelona, that's the big one to me. Obviously, a guy who they're expecting a lot out of. He's been getting some minutes for Barca too. And obviously he's a player that Barcelona see a lot in at the keeper position. Definitely worth getting him in the mix, seeing what he has to offer. Patrick Schulte of the Columbus Crew of St. Louis, Missouri is back. Zach Steffen is back, and Matt Turner is back. I think I would not have called Zach Steffen in if I was Mauricio Pochettino. I don't know. You call him 4 goalkeepers, so it's not egregious, but what has Zach Steffen done exactly to deserve a USMNT call-up? Like I said earlier, the worst keeper in post-shot expected goals saved above average of MLS goalkeepers that start regularly. made just a disastrous error in that game against the Galaxy. Did not look good at all through most of that series. And yet, here he is, where Pochettino is talking about how results matter, and he's back in. So maybe it's just, get him in the mix. Hope that maybe fixes what's going on there, because I genuinely do not know what has happened to Zach Steffen to force his confidence to just take such a nosedive. So maybe it's just get him in the U.S. camps, hope that being back in the national team can kind of rub off on him. But it's hard to see how many opportunities he has left, when, it's not a compelling goalkeeper position. Matt Turner, I think, is still the incumbent, but when you're not getting regular playing time, I think that hurts him. Patrick Schulte is kind of hit and miss. Some days he looks like he can be the goalkeeper of the future for the U.S. Some days it just looks normal. And I don't know if that is necessarily what the U.S. want in their goalkeeper. If you think back to just historically with the Brad Guzans, with the Tim Howards, with the Brad Friedels of the world, you need someone who is going to show up every game and be that spark plug for the team. Matt Turner has been there in the past, but when he's not getting consistent playing time, does that hurt him? I think we've seen areas where he doesn't look as sharp as he needs to. Come 2026, where all this is building to, where is Matt Turner going to be? Is Matt Turner still going to be in the mix at that point? And I think, start playing for the future a little bit. If you believe in Diego Cohen, then I think you need to play him in one of these matches. If you believe in Patrick Schulte, I think you need to play him in one of these matches. On the defense, you have Mark McKenzie from Toulouse, Tim Ream of Charlotte FC and of St. Louis fame, Chris Richard from Crystal Palace, Anthony Robinson, Miles Robinson, Joe Scally, and Austin Trusty. Austin Trusty has been playing great for Celtic this year. I actually was wondering if there was a world where Cameron Carter-Vickers and Austin Trusty are also the center back pair for the U.S. Of course, CCV not called in, but I think with how he's been playing for Celtic, I think he may bag another call-up at some point here. Mark McKenzie is someone I really like in the position. Tim Ream, I think, call him in for the St. Louis connection. And actually, I don't want to go too far because Tim Ream looked very good for Charlotte in the playoffs as well. I think some of his aging comments are blown out of proportion. I don't know if you want Tim Ream to be your starter, but I think having Tim Ream in the mix is good for everyone. He's experienced. He's been through everything. I cannot be more of a Tim Ream fan. And I think just having him there for that veteran status and someone who can come in and really, be confident under pressure. I think that's the downfall. Tim Ream has been overstated quite a bit, I think. And while he has moments where you're like, okay, Tim Ream should not be the starter for the future of the U.S. men's national team, I think you still want him in the mix. Chris Richards, someone I love, someone I have a lot of faith in for that position in the future. Jedi, of course, maybe one of the best fullbacks in the Premier League right now. Joe Scally, I think, is going to have a couple of interesting camps here to really push himself at that right back spot. And then, like I said, Austin Trusty, I think what he's done in Celtic, his stock has really risen, and he was already on the radar before. I think in the next couple of years, he's going to move to a big club, and you're going to have some really good center back depth in the future. But, maybe not right now. Maybe we still have to figure things out. So I don't have a problem at defense. I don't have a problem at midfield. So Brendan Aronson is back. Brendan Aronson's been having some good play for Leeds lately. Gianluca Busio for Valencia. Johnny for Real Betis. Weston McKennie, of course. Aidan Morris in Middlesbrough. Unas Musa, AC Milan, who Musa has been putting together some fantastic performances as well. Tanner Tessman for Lyon. And Malik Tillman. Oh my God, I can't talk today. Malik Tillman of PSV Eindhoven. Tillman was one of the best players this last round of the Champions League. Weah has had some good performances. I'm jumping ahead. Tessman has had some good performances. Morris, we know what he is. Johnny, I think, is interesting because Johnny, when he goes back to Betis, when he goes back to his club teams, he looks like he should be one of the best midfielders in the USMNT, but with how they've been using him, try to figure out, where he is at as a defensive mid. Should he be in a double pivot? Should he be up the pitch a little bit more? The U.S. just haven't found the best way to utilize him, and figuring that out should be a priority for Mauricio Pochettino, especially as we try to figure out, with Tyler Adams still injured, with Weston McKennie seemingly always injured, what's the best way to utilize all these pieces, especially when you're, not convinced you're going to always have your pieces. Gio Reyna is still injured, for instance. Their injuries have traditionally with this group of U.S. players has been an issue. And then onto the forwards, where I do have a little bit of an issue again, and maybe this also goes to midfield. Depends on how you view Diego Luna. I think Diego Luna should have already been called up 10 times over by now. You look at how he played for Real Salt Lake this year, Young Player of the Year in MLS. I don't know what he has to do to earn a U.S. call-up at this point. I think that this should have been the camp they brought him in, just coming off of a long, hard-fought season and a season where he really proved that he can be one of the better midfielders, one of the better wingers in MLS, depending on how you want to use them. If you look at what the U.S. has done at forward, and that's why I kind of thought the forward core especially, Cade Cowell, Alex Andeas, Brandon Vasquez, I think if you replace one of those with Diego Luna, I'm not mad about it. I talked about it, I think the last time we had this podcast, like a year ago, that I have kind of seen enough of Alex Andeas for a little while. I don't know what he has necessarily done to be called back in, but anyway, there's not too much you can be mad about, though. Christian Pulisic has been one of the best players in Europe to start the season. Ricardo Pepi has kind of forced his way into that PSV lineup as well as the starting striker over De Jong. Cade Cowell, I always love Cade Cowell. I just think that with what him, Vasquez, and Zendejas have done in Liga MX, I don't know if they've necessarily earned call-ups over some of the players in the pool, but I'm not going to be too mad about it. I think Pochettino still needs to see some players come through, still needs to see them eye to eye, and it's all in building towards 2026. So maybe if things go disastrous over these two games against Jamaica, maybe I'm having a different tune, but while I would make some changes to this player pool, I think overall of who is going to be in the starting 11, of who Pochettino is going to be relying on, that there's not a lot here to get too mad about. So let me know what you think about this lineup in the comments below, how you see them doing against Jamaica. And I think Jamaica is an interesting team too, because while I don't think there's a lot of hype for these matchups, Jamaica are putting together a very good team. Now, this is just putting all morals aside, all the type of players, the recruiting of Mason Greenwood aside, and how they treat their women's team aside. There's a lot of good English-based Jamaican players, and Mikel Antonio has proven before that he can be the death knell for the U.S. So definitely not a matchup that they can overlook, and one that Pochettino has to be careful of, because you can, of course, as you're building for 2026, as we are trying to figure out what the midfield looks like, what this formation looks like, it's kind of tough when you are playing competitive matches in the Nations League. Now, do they care about the Nations League? Nothing really needs to be done for qualifying. They're already qualified for 2026. But I don't think you can overlook these competitive matchups. Like, without the qualifying for the World Cup, these are kind of the matchups that battle test you a bit. It'll be interesting to see what the route to the World Cup looks like, just with who they're able to play, how they're able to simulate that battle-tested feeling of a World Cup qualifying. So, maybe it's all just experimental until then, but there is something on the line here in a quarterfinal Nations League match. Does Mauricio Pochettino care? I think it's more about, setting up for the future and finding these things that you can rely on in the future. But anyway, that is where we'll end it today. Thank you all so much for listening, for talking with me. Welcome back to the podcast. Of course, if you are not subscribed, please subscribe, give me a like. Let me know what you think in the comments below this video and this podcast. And as always, have a great day. We'll talk soon.